Intro music, okay, there we go. Well, thanks everyone for joining us this afternoon. I know it's been a long but hopefully really insightful day for all of you, and we're going to be getting ready for our reception later, which I'm really excited about over at the Indian Pueblo Cultural Center, which I hope many of you will join us about. We'll share some logistics about that later. This is one of the conversations I have been most excited about for this conference. For those of you who have known me and those of you who may not know me, I've worked for tribes and tribal leaders my whole career. I started out as a lawyer and moved to Washington, D.C., doing a lot of work at a lot of different policy organizations. And it's really important to me when I came into NAP that we actually strengthened our work with tribal nations. And we're going to really get into a deep and insightful conversation today about how sovereignty plays out in philanthropy here in the Southwest with two of my favorite people. For those of you who don't know what sovereignty is, it's really a critical principle for our people. It's the right of our people to determine our own futures. It's inherent. It's grounded in treaties and constitutional, and in the Constitution, we have a nation-to-nation relationship with the federal government. We carry that as a very solemn and important part of our lives in everything that we do, so we're going to get into some of that. First, I'd like to go ahead and welcome up our two panelists today. We've got Alvin Warren, the Vice President of Policy and Impact for the Los Alamos National Laboratory Foundation. Come on up. And then we have Hannah Honani, the Executive Director of the Hopi Foundation. Thank you for joining us.
He's going to do a quick voiceover.
With that? Oh,
Before we
sorry.
start the plenary.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm already breaking the rules, so sorry. Was there a voiceover that we need to do? Oh, okay.
At the end of this session, we will hold a Q&A poll. To submit your questions, log into the conference app, find the session in the agenda, and scroll down to the Submit Questions for Session section.
All right. Hopefully we're back on track now. So welcome both of you. I'm really excited about this conversation today. We're dealing with a lot right now. All of our communities are dealing with so much in the moment we're living in. I think that this is an opportunity for us to really dig into where we're at with tribal nations right now, what philanthropy's role should be when it comes to sovereignty and our nation-to-nation relationship, where philanthropy should be investing when it comes to these expansive federal cuts that we're seeing. But I want to start by just asking each of you to introduce yourselves. If you could tell us a little bit about who you are, where you come from, and your journey into the sector. Hannah, I want to start with you. I want to also, first of all, say Hopi is a really special place to me because when I was a baby lawyer back in the day, I actually did a lot of work with the Hopi tribal courts. I see Monica Duvamps out here taking photos as we speak from the Hopi Foundation, previously from the Hopi Foundation. But the Hopi Foundation was really transformational for me when I worked out at Hopi for the tribal courts because I met these unbelievable women who developed something that I had never seen in Indian country. A foundation truly grounded in our values and their values as Native people. I learned so much. And it was something that I've carried with me my entire life. So I'm just so excited to have you up here because it's a very special place. So I'll kick it over to you, Hannah, to tell us a little bit more about yourself.
Hi, everybody. My name's Hannah Onani. From the village of Sitomovi. Come from the Roadrunner clan there in First Mesa. And I've been a part of the foundation for a little over 10 years now. I like to say I grew up there because, again, I started out as a youth liaison for the Hopi Opportunity Youth Initiative, and it's funny because it's come full circle with Eric being at OYF. So a lot of you have also integrate into the Aspen Opportunity Youth Network, and so that's kind of where I grew up and learned a lot of best practices of where I'm at today, and has really contributed to the growth and the care that I have for my community. I didn't know about nonprofit or philanthropy at that, and so growing up in this sector, understanding my position as a woman, as a Native woman, has allowed me to grow in this area, and I'm so privileged and honored to be sitting before you to understand how I can advocate in this space, bring my seat to the table and have these conversations with you, and be really humble about what that means for us as Native Indigenous people. So thank you for that.
Great, thank you so much, Hannah. Alvin, we go back, I actually don't know when we first met each other, but we go back a ways. You know, I think the other thing about coming to places like New Mexico is that we are able to have conversations with leaders like you who have so much background in so many different spaces. You're a former tribal leader, you've worked in philanthropy. I'll let you say more about your own background. But one of the things I really learned from you early on as I started to get into philanthropy as this sector is really what philanthropy can actually do in tribal communities, and that there's a lot of different ways to think about that work. So would love to hear a little bit more about, you know, what brought you to this work, where you come from.
Good afternoon, everybody. Especially shout out to my Lano Foundation colleagues who are all sitting at the same table. How cool is that? I come from Santa Clara Pueblo, which is also known as Kapovi Owinga, the village of the wild roses. It's about an hour and a half north of here. I started my career in what we would now call the land back movement. I was called back by my tribe to help with the reacquisition of some of our traditional land, and that's actually how I got introduced to philanthropy. In a little bit, I'll probably tell that story in greater detail. But it was transformative, because at the time, I hadn't the slightest idea what philanthropy was. I don't think anybody else on our tribal council knew what it was. But at this really crucial time in our Pueblo's history, philanthropy played this key role that allowed us to regain the largest amount of land that we had regained in almost a century. And so it planted a seed. Earlier, we heard some talk about seeds. It planted a seed for me about philanthropy. So as my career kind of moved on, like Eric, I worked in tribal government for a while. I was in tribal government for about 8.5 years. And then I got pulled into state government, and after that into philanthropy. But I've continued to be involved in tribal government. In fact, I'm serving this year as an elected tribal official for Santa Clara. I think this might be my 13th, I've stopped counting, 13th term or something like that. So I'm really appreciative of having this conversation, because I think there are so many missed opportunities between philanthropy and tribal governments, tribal nations, that, especially in these times, none of us can really afford.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks so much, Alvin. You know, one of the things, as I mentioned, I took over NAPA a little over 5 years ago, and as I mentioned, I mostly spent my time working for tribes, tribal leaders, tribal institutions, and I realized that, you know, we were already in an uphill battle trying to help the philanthropic sector understand who Native people were. But then when you got into the whole topic of tribes, it was like a whole other ball game, right? And so one of the things that we did at NAP was to launch the Tribal Nations Initiative, which was really to start a new kind of dialogue between philanthropy and our tribal nations. We did listening tours across the country with tribal leaders and foundations and Native-led nonprofits that were supporting them. And the bottom line that came out of it was, yeah, we don't know what the sector is. They might know, you know, a foundation name or something. But the experience with philanthropy was practically nothing in most tribal communities. And to your point, Alvin, there's so many missed opportunities when you're working inside, right? So I want to go to you, Hannah, to that point is, you know, like I said, the Hopi Foundation has been such an important leader for so long for all of us in this space, that intersection between tribal government, community, and philanthropy. Can you tell us a little bit more about, you know, what kinds of mindsets, attitudes, processes the philanthropic sector really needs to start to embrace to better serve the needs of tribal governments? And even more, how can philanthropy partner with tribal governments and tribal communities to really help them thrive?
Sure. So the mindset around all of what you just shared is to be okay with not knowing everything. Come with your attitude in that same tangent is to come as a learner. Come as a learner, because that's the only way you're ever gonna be a sponge and understand who we are as Indigenous people. There's no cookie cutter solutions to all of us. We're all very different in how we facilitate our work. We all have grounding values that we stand in and embody every single day. And I think the last thing about relationships is understanding that the sustainable part of that is in the root of how we build those relationships from the very beginning. Being honest in your humility of not knowing what this tribe is about, what this community is all about. And so I want to welcome that come see us. That's my open invitation to all of you to come see us in our community, in our homelands, to understand the breadth of who we are. Because I could talk to you all day about who we are, what we do, and how beautiful it is, but until you come see it for your own self and experience that, you will never understand the true breadth of how we do our work.
That's great. Yeah, it's. I feel like such important points. I especially appreciate what you say about, I think one of the things NAP does across the country is to always encourage funders to listen to exactly what you just said and to actually act on it. Visit, learn. How can we as a national organization be a partner in that? But you've got to start that journey somewhere, which I think is so critical. Alvin, since you've got your whole crew here, partners like LANL have been really critical in the field for us as national partners, I think, because of your grounding in a place like this, where you're from, your relationships, the community connections. What are some of the things that you want to share from your work, especially since you've worked across a couple of different funding organizations, about how to build those relationships in a place? So we've got a lot of regional funders. We have some funders that do national work. But what does that relationship building work look like? And how have you, in your current role at LANL right now, how are you bringing those relationships to networks like this? How do you see yourself as a sort of network for the people that you work with right here at a national level too?
So it is great that my colleagues are here, because to really do this well, it can't be just one person. It's got to be part of the entire organization and the way the organization works. So first, it begins with staffing. And I'm very proud that our board has had Native members of the board for a long time. And not just one person, it's been multiple people who've been in leadership roles, sometimes simultaneously being the board chair and the vice chair. Having our senior leadership reflect Native communities, having our staff, having multiple advisory groups and committees, some formal, some informal, and then just the networks that we're involved in, and always calling upon those networks to advise us, to guide us, and to give us feedback, sometimes critical feedback about how the work we're doing, where we may be falling short, how we could do that work better. And in every project, every initiative, in our case, we give grants, we give scholarships, we engage in policy. It's a constant conversation with tribal governments and with folks who lead Native organizations and work for them that enhances how we do our work. And I think the other thing that I really want to commend my colleagues for doing is we constantly try to look for opportunities to put ourselves into the background and give our partners sort of an opportunity to be at the front, whether it's in policy, whether it's in grant making, whether it's in other things that we do. And I think that's maybe part of the answer to the second part of your question is philanthropy sits at a really interesting intersection, and an intersection of privilege. We have access not just to financial resources, we have access to information. Mm-hmm. We have access to people with influence. And if we're not deliberately making those connections for those we work with and work on behalf of, then we're actually perpetuating kind of a distancing, or in fact a disempowerment of those who we aim to serve.
That's such a great point you hit on, because for those of you who were at the plenary earlier, I was mentioning our breakfast with our Native youth grant makers, and that was one of the biggest aha moments I've had. Sometimes you're amazed at, when you're working at national organizations, the things that should be so common sense, but they're still an aha moment to you. And one of them was just even being at a national organization, your access to relationships, to information, to networks is so important and powerful, but we don't always bring our own people into those spaces, right? And so to your point about the knowledge and the information that you have in those networks, I think it's so important that when we're in these spaces that are at those intersection of these networks, that we're really pulling those chairs up in that way, which I think is so critical. For both of you, this is not usually my MO, because I really believe in lifting up what works and underlining all of the things that are stories about effective partnerships and relationships, but I think for a lot of people who haven't worked with tribal governments, sometimes we really do need to get into like what hasn't worked. So I'm curious from either of you, where have you really found funders have stumbled when it comes to working with tribal nations and tribal communities? And, are there some things that you feel like we could share as lessons learned for the field?
I think from my experience and being in the last 5 years in the administrative level and where the breakdown in relationship happens is coming with your prescription of what you think we should do. That is going to be the immediate turnoff, and I'm not afraid to say no. And I've learned that early on. And hearing stories of my predecessors, Barbara Poli and Monica Navamsa, that's where we have to stand firm in our values of what is important to us as a community, because that is our responsibility to be in service to our community. That's a heavy lift for us that are in leadership. But again, it's also the responsibility of our staff to steward that work in a meaningful way. And so when Mr. Warren was talking about bringing community to the table, we are truly community-based. We have community advisory boards that infiltrate everything that we do and is an example of best practice. So when you come to us saying we have money, be ready for me to ask you, what is your intention? And be honest about it. Be honest about what your intention is, and that's where we're gonna build a relationship, a common thread, if we can, about where we want to go and move forward and where your impact's gonna be made and your investment. So I think that coming with that prescription is not gonna help at all. It's gonna be the roadblock already to our community of what you think we should be doing.
100% agree with that. I think that's the most fundamental mistake I think that a lot of funders make. What I guess I want to add, one is a corollary to that, which is there's the coming in with an idea of what success looks like. So if you're supporting early childhood education, this is what high quality early childhood education looks like. And already having blinders on that if a community says, like the previous panel said, to us, high-quality early childhood education is all about the revitalization of our language. And if somebody goes to their framework and says, wait, language is not on our framework, I'm sorry, we can't fund you, that's already a problem. But the other thing is having structures that don't fit, providing how the best way for a particular tribe to receive funding. And I'm going to make eye contact with RJ, who's sitting there, who's one of my colleagues in early childhood. His team has this great working relationship with several of the tribes in our region and have provided rounds of funding to them to support early childhood, their particular plans, implementation of their early childhood plans, but have had to constantly adapt how to provide that funding, really kind of working in this really interesting kind of partnership, because some tribes, you provide them with one mechanism, that's going to work fine. Another, you have to adapt it to get the resources there. And so going in with only one sort of standard approach, even among a few tribes, is destined to fail. There's a couple other things that I would want to add. Did you want to add to that?
No, go ahead. I'll
No,
go
go ahead.
you. No,
please.
I just want to hone in on that part about being flexible. Us as nonprofits, we are that. We have to adapt. We have to adjust. We have to pivot. COVID, one example, a recent example of how we had to pivot. We asked that of Philanthropy to be able to pivot, because even if you give us a multi-year funding opportunity, 5 years, be ready to pivot with us during those 5 years, because it's never going to be the same for those next 5 years. Our strategies might change, our objectives and the way it looks might change. So be ready to move with us if you're invested over those long years.
Good point. Can I add two more?
Yeah, please jump in.
There are abundant misperceptions and misunderstandings in both directions. There are a number of funders who don't understand how tribal governments work, and there are a lot of tribal leaders and folks who work for tribes who have no clue about how foundations work. And we don't create enough deliberate, safe, welcoming spaces to have those conversations, which is why I'm just so grateful for NAP creating that focus on tribal governments, because it can't be at the moment where you announce your grant application, the deadline's coming up, and then that's when you try to build a relationship or try to get to know each other. And the other one I wanted to mention is this false dichotomy as a funder, that I have to choose between funding a tribal government or a native nonprofit. And I think there's a conversation to be had because, and I want to make it clear to this whole room, I believe the work that Native-led nonprofits do does support tribal sovereignty. It's an essential part of that. Whether they're working near tribes or in an urban area, it is all enhancing tribal sovereignty because it's all building, all of us are connected, right? And I think sometimes there's this perception, well, I have to make a choice. I'm either going to fund, Native nonprofits or I'm going to fund a tribal government. That is a fundamental misperception of how our communities work and how sovereignty gets strengthened.
Yeah, these are such great points. It was really interesting for me to move from the policy space into philanthropy. I could write a whole book on a lot of that, but we'll get to that another time. But I think, one of the things that was so similar about it were these safe spaces, that we're talking about, to sort of like ask the questions that, feel dumb, but also to try to understand, like, how do I actually try to build these relationships a certain way? And I really appreciate you two both underscored the need to do that. And I think that's where our partnerships really matter between our kinds of organizations, because those that we're hoping to try to invest resources in our communities are going to have a lot of different pathways there, right? And so we got to figure out how we keep those pathways in a really good way together. This is another one of those, I think for both of you, I'd love to hear is, do you have any specific examples of where you've really seen successful partnerships? And this could be partnerships between you as funders and tribal governments, or multi-sector partnerships. Like, where do you feel like it's working well for tribes when it comes to working with philanthropy? What are some specific examples?
I'm going to share a really recent one that I've been a part of from the beginning, and he was up here talking today. He is the example of how a relationship should be stewarded between a tribal nation and a foundation, and that's Waverly Street Foundation. Mr. Hussein Almar, like, I've had the best experience from the very beginning up until the end of this month. Wayfarer is their approach. You talked about safe space, you talked about being able to be who we are without, repercussion, without judgment. That's the safest space that I've ever been a part of in my new leadership role. And I think that even my predecessors before me have stewarded this relationship with honesty and integrity that upholds and speaks to the sustainability of the foundation for over 40 years, the Hopi Foundation, over 40 years. And I'm truly have big moccasins to fill with those ladies. And I'm truly grateful for the guidance they've given me to be able to stand in that, also without judgment, as a woman leader. So I think that that relationship with Wayfarer has really begun to pivot philanthropy and our relationship and what it can be. There's extreme potential, and I welcome that for any of you that want to come see us at Hopi.
Any specific examples you want to share, Alma?
Yeah, I mentioned earlier kind of the one that brought me into philanthropy, but I feel it's useful to share a little bit more the details of it, that experience. So almost 30 years ago, I was in my 20s, and I was working as what was called the land claims coordinator for Santa Clara Pueblo. And the headwaters of the stream that flows through our reservation, literally the lifeblood of our culture, happened to end up in an adjacent private ranch. And it had been taken from us, separated from us for 137 years. And overnight we heard that the federal government was in talks to buy that ranch and acquire it, for the Forest Service. And it occurred to me that this was our moment in history, that we could actually intervene somehow to regain that. And, I was 27, pretty foolish and audacious and naive. And I thought, well, we'll just, tell the federal government that they shouldn't have taken it in the first place. And they'll just have this wonderful opportunity to return it, and they'll be happy to do it.
I wish it worked.
You can imagine how that argument went over. And they basically just ignored us. They ignored the outreach that our tribal leaders did. And a foundation had recently moved to Santa Fe, New Mexico from LA called the Land End Foundation, not Land Old Foundation, the Land End Foundation. And they reached out to my father to kind of get a sense of of how they could support tribes, because they had recently decided to have an Indigenous peoples program. And in that conversation with my dad, he mentioned this situation we were in with this piece of land. Little did we know what that was going to do. So that foundation first hired an attorney to look at the merits of our legal claims and found that it was the strongest claim, one of the strongest claims he had seen in his career, and basically wrote a report that said, and there's 0% chance that Santa Clara will be able to regain the land through any kind of other way but purchase. Wow. And the challenge is, and I was tribal treasurer in 1999, the purchase price for our portion would have ended up being 4 times our annual tribal budget. So there's just no way we would have been able to do that. And after that legal analysis was done, the Land and Foundation came to us and said, you negotiate, we'll be with you, and whatever it costs, we'll pay. To this day, it's 30 years later, and I try to think of other foundations who operate in that way. Fortunately, the field now is filled with many more foundations that have moved towards that kind of true solidarity. But I reflect on that all the time. They didn't dictate to us what we should want. They didn't put restrictions on us. They stood in solidarity, and they didn't just say, well, we'll give you the money. They gave us resources, they gave us legal support, but they also knew when to get into the background and just let us do our work. And when the celebration came, they didn't really want credit. And I'm just still to this day really moved by that example of philanthropy.
Wow, what a great example. Yeah, I feel like that's the kind of storytelling in philanthropy that's just so powerful, because, you had so many lessons that I hope a lot of other funders take to heart about practice, but also values and purpose, right? And why you're doing this work in the first place. I think in our experience too, just to sort of jump in on this question of my own a little bit, one of the things I've learned a lot about sort of the role that organizations like NAP can play in this space is that, a lot of this is about us first and foremost listening to tribal leaders, to tribal communities, and just basically taking their basic advice. One of the ones that killed us in when we were doing our listening tour to really better understand how we wanted to strategically position the Tribal Nations Initiative originally, the number of times things like match guarantees came up was it was in every single conversation. And any of us who've worked in Indian country knows we hate these match guarantees. We shouldn't have to we shouldn't have to pay them in the first place, but they really are a huge barrier to us applying for grants. Right. And if you've ever met anyone in an administrative office at a tribal government who has to deal with all of the grant writing and other kinds of business at the tribe, it's just another huge issue. And so, when all the new federal infrastructure money was coming through with the IRA and the infrastructure bill, there was a big pool of funding called the America the Beautiful Challenge that was distributing hundreds of millions of new dollars into the field. And we're like, well, let's figure out how to get rid of this match guarantee. It's like the easiest thing we could do, right? So we partnered with our good friends, Tracy Goodluck is here in the front, who used to work for the Department of Interior with us. And nice to see you again, who's now the new executive director of the Center for Native American Youth, which I'm extremely excited about, my former employer. Sorry to do a shout out on you there, Tracy. But we developed an MOU together with the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation that said to every tribe, we're just going to guarantee the match on any successful tribal application. And we went to our community of funders, we pooled the money together, and we wrote a check in the background, and the tribes just didn't have to worry about it. And that was like one of the simplest things you could do. And, most of those tribes didn't even know who those funders were necessarily. And, I think there's so many of those things that are out there that have a lot of impact, right? I think I do want to get onto this topic about the federal cuts as a segue, because I think, there's no way that we can avoid that in this conversation. This is a tough time for all our communities in this joint network. I think for those of you who haven't worked as much with tribal communities, we have a unique relationship with the federal government, because not only is it a legal and political relationship, but we have a lot of different federal funding streams we rely on, and a lot of them have been cut, a lot of them are in danger. Many more of them have become exempt under some of these executive orders, but like the rest of the field, philanthropy is being pulled in a million directions about what to do about this, right? And I'm curious from either of your standpoint, what would be your message about the right role for philanthropy right now? Because a lot of our organizations are out there defending, trying to restore that funding, but we all know philanthropy can't fill the gap, nor it should, especially with treaty-bound revenue streams. But really curious, like what if we go talk to funders right now, what is the best thing they can be doing to try to help us in this really tough time when it comes to those kinds of revenue streams?
So first, I think it isn't just one thing, because we have funders that specialize in particular areas that can be very useful. There's a legal strategy that tribes are going to have to pursue. Lawsuits cost money. There are folks who I think can connect with resources, and I do think, although philanthropy can't take the place of federal dollars, in really targeted specific ways, there are ways to at least keep the doors open on a particular program that might risk being shut down, or staff that might be let go. And it all involves, I mean, I could just give additional examples. Advocacy, narrative. So, I mean, one of the things is it appears as if, for the most part, we've won the argument that tribal sovereignty, that tribes do not fit under this sort of broad idea of DEI, and therefore, by definition, merit cuts. We shouldn't take that for granted, because there's still a fundamental misunderstanding about tribal sovereignty, period, across our country. But that didn't just happen by accident. It was a concerted communication strategy and lobbying strategy to reinforce that this is not an argument you want to use by virtue of inherent sovereignty, treaties, and so forth. So there are many ways I think that funders can engage, but it ultimately comes down to having those conversations with tribal leadership, attending things like NCAI and other gatherings, being in contact with the other affinity groups that work in the different areas, like NIEA. There's a national coalition of the Native advocacy organizations and nonprofits, really carefully following what they're doing, what their strategy is, how to be able to support and inform that. So there are a variety of ways. And then I don't want to leave this out. Although foundations are also kind of, particular foundations are getting attacked in this same climate, foundations still sit in a very privileged position to influence. And some foundations can't get involved in any kind of policy advocacy, others do. And so even your own influence can be very helpful as an unexpected ally, as an unexpected voice where tribes or tribal funding is getting attacked.
That's great. Anything from you, Han?
Yeah, I just want to hone in on the last part you were mentioning that, and I want to hone in on as a nonprofit leader, is that there's limitations to our advocacy as a 501c3 status. And although that's being attacked and what have you under this DEI initiative, it's helping to build stronger collaborative efforts on those on the national level advocating for us. Those are relationships we have to steward in a responsible manner to be able to inform them on how that ripple effect is going to eventually get to us. We don't see it right now, but it will. Our local radio station is already under threat for it. And that's not scary, but it's understanding the dynamics and understanding that we cannot be reactive, but proactive. How do we leverage these networks, these collaborative relationships to inform them how that ripple effect is going to eventually hit us? And it's going to hit us hard. And so when I talk to philanthropy partners, we need general support, general ops, to sustain us for a few years until this guy disappears. And so again, I'm really thankful for those partnerships, the National Council of Nonprofits, AZ Impact for Good. Those are our allies right now that I can name that I've been in conversation with about, okay, how do we inform you. What do you need from us to help advocate at those levels? Because I can't be in those spaces all the time. And I'm grateful for those relationships and understanding how those dynamics play out, and that we all, in essence, now need to come together to stand strong against what's coming right now. And I want to encourage and empower everybody to hone in on those relationships and be collaborative right now. This is the time for it, and we must stand stronger together in solidarity for everything that we do in our communities.
Absolutely, such a great point, and I'm so glad you brought up the radio station. When I was working out at the tribal courts, the trailer we were working out of was right next to the radio station, and I point to that because I think that's a good snapshot into the other thing that I see in working with funders, trying to help them understand how our communities work when it comes to the interplay between our nonprofits and our governments and our foundation, are that oftentimes things that you wouldn't necessarily understand are being run through different parts of the government, through foundations that were developed by tribes. And you need to know that too. You need to, again, be out in the community to understand all of the different leaders that are working in that community and a lot of different kinds of institutions to support, this critical work. I want to bring it back to the Southwest a little bit, Hannah, because you all have been a really important regional leader, because you've been there for a long time. You've been educating and driving so much of this work, and I'm just curious, what is some of the work that's going on in the Southwest that you feel like has some national implications? Are there some lessons nationally that we can learn from the work that you've been doing in the Southwest?
I think part of that is what I was sharing earlier is our understanding who we are as Native and Indigenous communities. The best practices, again, it's the root of who we are is the relationships that we built with you, the reciprocity. And so I'm really thankful that from NAP, I've learned a lot of what those best practices are, and it's really the 5 R's, and it's really the values that we uphold as different, Native communities. It's respect, responsibility, reciprocity, redistribution, and again, relationships. We all understand that, and we have our own words for that. So if you're ever curious, I'm privileged to give you an example of what that means for us, and it's going to mean differently across the different Indigenous communities. But I think that for the Southwest, those are critical to who we are. That's our identity. That's our being. That's our livelihood that we, again, live every single day. And I will never compromise that for whatever reason. And those are things that I have to uphold as a Hopi Foundation. And again, in retrospect, speaks to the sustainability that we've been around for a very long time.
That's great. I think as we're starting to round out our conversation, I'm curious from either of you, is there one thing that you would say a funder who has not been involved in any work supporting tribal sovereignty or investing in tribal communities, is there one thing that they should be doing that you'd want to focus on? I would also put it this way, what's some of the stuff like NAP should be doing as, the work that we're trying to do to educate the field right now? Like, what should we be focusing on when it comes to building partnerships with tribes, doing the work, supporting you all as funders? Would love to hear some advice for our work.
Oh. We'll let Hannah get a drink. So I'm going to concentrate on the why, the what, and the how. The why, and I don't know that it's been underscored enough here, but I'm going to underscore it, is I want my foundation colleagues in the room to recognize and realize that the resources that our foundations have in many ways and in many cases are derived from the exploitation and the theft of Indigenous lands and resources. We have to recognize with that. And we also have to realize that theft and that exploitation was made possible by undermining tribal sovereignty, by destabilizing tribes as political entities. So the why for me, there's a compelling why that I could tell you in every program area that any foundation cares about, there's a way to do that work in tribal communities. But the why I also want people to embrace is we have what I would call a moral and an ethical responsibility. because we're stewards of resources that are derived from that process of colonization. And that process of colonization is not a historical fact, it is a current reality. So that's number one. And I think that necessarily reframes our thinking from a place that none of us wants to be, which is this sort of act of charity, to an act of solidarity and partnership. So that's first. The what? There are an incredible number of examples happening throughout tribal communities, Native-led organizations, of really impressive work, often severely underfunded. And although many of us who've worked in tribal communities or for Native nonprofits might wear that as a badge of honor, that is yet another reflection of what you all have just done with Bridgespan in your report, is when a group of people and entities like tribal governments have been doled out meager amounts of funding from federal governments, from state governments, and from philanthropy, and have to get creative as an act of survival, that shouldn't be a reason to say, you do such a great job with $10,000, so we're gonna just give you $10,000. $1 million problem is not gonna get solved with $100,000. So there are abundant examples of tribes and Native organizations doing fantastic work that could be scaled, that could be expanded, that with the appropriate amount of resources. And then I think that gets to the how, which is where NAP comes in. There are a lot of well-meaning funders who kind of grasped the first two, and they still don't quite know how to do it. And that's fair. That is absolutely fair. And I think there's a healthy amount, and I've experienced this my whole career in the social sector, a healthy amount of reasonable fear of making a mistake and of making things worse. And although I can respect that, an organization like NAP really can come in to say, here's a way for you to see how you can do this work in a way that is respectful, in a way that is appropriate, in a way that you can still navigate your internal requirements and be proud of what results. So I think that's why we're fortunate to have an app, to be that kind of learning space and that connector, so that funders who want to do this work can find a way to do it.
Yes.
Great, yeah.
I want to elaborate on, not elaborate, but lift that last note up about how NAP can come in as a resource, is continuing to provide those safe spaces to learn. Because those of us that come into nonprofit work may have been our first time, we may be seasoned veterans, whatever. There's a lot of learning that still has to happen. And I think for a lot of communities, and I've heard it already for the few days that I've been here, is that there's a generation of healing, generations, I should say, of healing that has to happen over time. And the sooner you understand that in philanthropy, the sooner you will be able to make a greater investment if you know the pathways in which to infiltrate communities in that way and build relationships. Because again, at the root of any community's well-being is to address the healing as a mirror holding it up to our face. And we do that for each other in community, is understanding that generational trauma. Me coming in as a third generation of leadership at the Hopi Foundation, I'm seeing that change happen. And I'm trying to stand strong in that, but I also have our elders in the community that are still very much closed in. They're like, why are you talking to so-and-so? Why are you talking to Pahanam? Pahanam is white people. Why are you bringing them to our community? It's the backlash we have to deal with. But again, at the root of that is the integrity and the value system that I uphold, because I know why I'm doing it. And when it comes to philanthropy, I want to encourage you to understand why you're in philanthropy and what that definition means. Go back to the root of what that means, is the love for humankind and the goodwill of others. And what does that mean for you, and how are you going to steward that? Us as tribal nations have that, and that's the sovereignty that we're just talking about. We have the right, and we don't own anything at our homes, but we're stewards of the land, right? And so it's our responsibility to be the caretakers of that land, the people, and its resources, like Mr. Warren was saying. And so that's the heavy lift that we all have to do as a community. And so again, there's a lot of common ground that we have to continue to build and have conversations around, but don't be afraid to have those conversations. Like I was saying, don't be afraid to come and say, I don't know about so-and-so. I don't know about this community. When you come to the table and you ask, that's the first step, right? Bring your humility with you. Don't ever forget that.
Those are such great points, and this is really valuable for me to hear, just in thinking about how it relates to a lot of the different kind of work that we've done, because I really feel like a lot of the work that we're doing constantly, because we sit at this sort of intersection between philanthropy and community and tribal governments and so many different partners that out in the field, it's really about being a guide to some extent. And a lot of guiding is often just platforming the stories about what's working, what are good partnerships. A lot of it is about how do you actually do the brass tacks of some of the practice in the work. And then it's really about creating communities and education around it. So some of the things I have most enjoyed in this role so far is really being able to bring funders together in those spaces where they can really they can be educated, but they can also co-design and launch things together. One of the things we do with environmental work that we have is we've got a partnership with Biodiversity Funders Group, which is a large national network of the conservation funders out there, and we have a Tribal Nations Climate and Conservation Funding Collaborative. And that match guarantee that I mentioned is part of that partnership, but the other part of it is that we lead a learning community where we bring in tribal leaders and tribal conservation staff to really just educate that funder network, who are a lot of very nerdy people too, by the way. I don't know if any of you are in the conservation funding community, but it's a pretty nerdy funding network. So, they get a lot of it, but they don't necessarily always get some of the tribal perspective on the work. And that's been the sort of slow work of trying to move the field ahead and just making sure that we're creating spaces for Native people, tribal leaders on the ground to do that work together and to do it in partnership and community with funders. And I think we need more of those kinds of spaces. I know we're rounding out our time here, so I wanted to just round us out on just asking, is there anything else you'd like to leave the audience with tonight? Anything that we haven't covered on this topic of working with tribal communities?
I want to hone in on the spirituality and faith that all of our Indigenous communities come from. That's really what kind of drives why we do this work. It's our faith in our ceremonies, in our language, and how we exemplify that every day through the values that we live. And that's the unseen part that sometimes we can't always measure. And if Philanthropy or other partners come to us and want to work with us, that's the part you're not going to see, but it's going to be shown through the work that we do every day. And so I want to just make sure that that's never forgotten and is also the root of how we build relationships with one another, is that faith and that spirituality that comes in with the particularly special group of communities that we all engage with, right? And so never forget that that's the part of it. And that's probably something you'll never see, maybe not understand, but know that it's there and that it feeds the breadth of work that we all do. And it's very important, and I want to make sure I lift that up for all of us that come from faith-based communities. And it's natural. It's a natural thing for us.
Thank you. Alvin?
I think I want to focus on the topic of leadership. I think foundations, as part of whatever strategies they want to pursue in supporting tribal sovereignty, are very thoughtful and intentional about supporting leadership development. And I think one of the best examples is the woman sitting next to me on my right. Many of us have looked to the Hopi Foundation as an inspiration. And we know Barbara, who's in the hallway, some of us have run into her, and Monica, and now Ms. Honani. And there will be other Ms. Honanis coming after you. And to see that succession over time is such a privilege, because we know that the Hopi Foundation is going to remain strong even as it goes through these transitions. So I want funders to think about that, because A lot of times we say we invest in projects, but we also invest in people.
Yes.
And so, but the other one is a challenge. And I'm getting a little bit gray up here, maybe gray in here. So I'm starting to lose some of the filters that I maintained through many of my times in this sector. And so I'm going to just be blunt. And I hope I'm preaching to the choir, but if I'm not, I hope those of you who can take this and do something constructive with it will. If your foundation does not have 2 Native people on your board, the next time you attend NAP, I want to ask you to change that. And if you have 2, add more. I feel like this is one of the most fundamental structural things that we can do to ensure that foundations make generational commitments to being in partnership with Native communities. Because what we hear over and over from leaders like Ms. Honani is don't, yes, come visit us, but also don't just make a 2-year commitment and then you're gone. This is an enduring relationship that we want to build. And the only way you can assure that in our sector is to make sure that board leadership are ensuring that that is the direction of the foundation. When they hire the executive leadership, they make that clear to that executive leadership. When they have to make hard decisions about where to invest, that they're guided by these principles. And it's not just to say that only Native people can do that, but we can have many allies. We're very fortunate in our foundation to have many allies, non-Native allies with Native folks at every part of our organization. But Native leadership is essential.
Yes.
So please invest in that. Please take that back. I know for some of you, it's a bigger ask. Mm-hmm. Some of you, your structure may not allow that, and I may say okay, but still keep pushing, because that's the only thing that's fundamentally going to change our sector in the long run.
Yeah, really quick, from a nonprofit side of things, that goes the same for us too. We have to invest in our best asset, which is our own people. Raise them, and that's exactly how I was raised. I don't have a really nice degree, but I have lived experience. And a lot of what I do hits home with my own children, with my own family. And so being able to surround myself with my own community to work with and invest in them and build them to these different capacities and to their strengths of what they like to do, that's an example and is in our mission of growing our own at the same time. And so if you can understand those dynamics, I really, I'm really appreciative of that. And that's where my humility comes from, because I don't come from academia. I come from lived experience and growing up in my own community.
So such great points. And just to Alvin's point, if you haven't had a chance, our partners at First Nations Development Institute just put out a report on Native leadership on boards, which I think is a critical resource in this moment. Please join me in thanking Hannah and Alvin for this rich conversation. Thank you so much. And I'm just going to share a little bit of housekeeping as we round out our day, because I know we've got some celebrations going on. NAP will be having its award celebration over at the Indian Pueblo Cultural Center, and not to put you back on the spot, but Alvin is our Louis Delgado Award winner this evening, so we'll be honoring Alvin this evening. And shuttles for the Cultural Center will be leaving at 5:30. For those of you who have not been here before, it's an amazing space. We're going to have some great celebration. We're going to have some dancing, refreshments, and we also have some vendors there too. Even some of our Native Youth grant makers will be setting up shop over there, so please bring your money. And I think that's my only housekeeping item. So thank you all. I hope you have a wonderful evening, and we'll see you tomorrow. Oh, yeah. Forget.